After the accident, they thought I couldn't speak, think, or stand. My wife brought her lover into our home and whispered in my ear, "You should have died that day." She never realized I was healing and waiting for the moment she tried to erase me completely. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is Michael Carter. I used to build things for a living. Porches, bookcases, the sort of honest woodwork that keeps a house steady. The accident changed the sound of my world. One afternoon, a truck and a wrong glance, and my world got measured in hospital wristbands and the soft authority of machines. They put a wheelchair under me and called me patient, the way people call an old photograph memory. Everyone began to treat me like a problem that required caretaking, not like a man who would find a way. At first, the voices were the kind you expect. Doctors in clipped tones, therapists with their small hopeful charts, friends who come and bring casseroles. My wife, Jenna, was careful. She wore bright scarves that said, "I am here." She kissed my forehead in a way that said, "I am doing my duty." But gestures can camouflage a thin impatience. The first time I heard laughter meant only for two people. At the far end of the living room, while I stared at the television, I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what paralysis teaches you, to wait out the worst of your suspicions. Then she brought him home. He was careful about how he sat. He checked his watch, placed his hands on his knees like a man who knows where applause belongs. They introduced him as a friend, as someone helping with logistics. He called me sir in a voice that had none of the patience of a real friend. One afternoon, while the nurse went for supplies and I pretended to nap against the pillow, Jenna bent low and, as if sharing an inside prayer, whispered into my ear, "You should have died that day." It was the smallest, meanest line, no flourish, no camera-ready cruelty. It had the peculiar intimacy of a sentence reserved for late-night resentments. She expected me to be finished. She expected the chair, the pain, my reduced silence to be permanent. She had already accounted for my absence. That's when I started to collect. Not money, not revenge trophies. Evidence. Small things that make a story true when you fold them together. A missed tray first. I wrote the date on the inside page of a battered appointment book I'd always kept next to my bedside. September 12th. Tray returned. October 3rd. Staff report. Resident left dishes. I took pictures when I could. A plate with cold food. A small puddle where no one had caught a spilled cup. A calendar with visits that said, "No show." I learned which aides looked away and which ones carried truths quietly in their pockets. The healing came slower than I wanted, and in ways nobody understood. Therapy taught me the technical steps: how to flex a toe, how to brace a shoulder, how to make one part of the body pick up for another. In the dark of the night, when visitors had gone and the facility smelled of bleach and boiled coffee, I practiced the small victories. I moved a finger until it felt like reclaiming territory. I shifted weight slightly to the left until it felt possible to shift again. Muscle is stubborn, but will is more stubborn. Little by little, my body remembered how to be whole enough to do something I had decided I would do: stand. People who live in the middle of betrayal assume the betrayer will be dramatic. Tearful apologies, awkward conversation, or the blunt arrogance of denial. What Jenna chose was the slow architecture of erasure. She filed papers. She called accountants. She put a charming man in a nice shirt in a photo and practiced the smile she wanted the world to believe was earned. She booked a small closing at our kitchen table, a moment where she would have me sign forms that made me legally unable to interfere. She thought that legal ink could do what cruelty could not: finalize absence. I watched her practice. It would have been easy to explode. There's a particular power in a sudden shout that makes people flinch, but shouting would have been a moment. I wanted a structure. I wanted her world to bend in a way that could not be repaired by a viral apology. So I kept notes. I backed up voicemails. When she said burden in the tone of someone exhausted, I saved it and made copies. When she texted him and called me closed chapter, I forwarded the messages to an email I had set up and secured. The small documentation was boring to make, but beautiful in its effectiveness, and I found allies where you least expect them. Rosa, who worked nights, had the laugh of someone who knew hard work and had the courage to be kind. She started slipping my information into small files, a photo of an untouched tray, a note about a missed medication. Tom, a veteran in the next room, would glance out the window and say things like, "You're doing good today, Mike." He became a face in the crowd that would later nod in affirmation when required. Every plan, when you craft it quietly, will have weak seams, moments where doubt could be introduced, and the plan unravels. I built my own disrupting doubts into the fabric of her narrative. In the middle of a casual conversation, I asked the social worker a question about who signs that paperwork, the way a man asks about prices at an auction to learn how the whole trade works. I left small contradictions lying around, an unpaid invoice, a time-stamped voicemail, so the stories she wanted to tell about me would be harder to sell. The week slid into a kind of rehearsal for confrontation. Jenna would bring him by the house, as if introducing him to a photo album. She would mention a weekend trip she'd be taking. For stress, she called it, and she would laugh, as if amused to be unburdened. The administrative packets began to arrive. Guardianship forms, petitions with language about capacity, lines like incapacitated and best interest. She read them with the casual efficiency of someone signing a contract she had already priced. I realized that the fight ahead would not be a single explosive scene. It would be a sequence of small, undeniable facts laid in public, one after another. You cannot chase someone from a room with a speech. People will shout back and internet comments will shout louder. But you can, with records and witnesses, make their life impossible to trust. So I prepared to stand. Standing is not dramatic in real life. It is a slow arithmetic. Breath steadies, hands find purchase, muscles that have been soft find tension. I worked on the tiny motions no one expects to matter. I practiced the weird coordination of shifting weight and placing feet. I learned the exact moment a nurse would turn her back to lift a tray. I timed my small movements between visiting hours and the clatter of cartwheels in the hall. The day she thought she would sign, everything was clear as any day in a slow-weather storm. She had her pen. She had the buyer's brochure folded like a gospel in her purse. She had the lover's casual hand on his knee. They arrived smiling, confident in a neat performance. The administrator sat with paperwork that smelled faintly of staples and legal ink. I had rehearsed the sound of my breath. I had practiced what I would say in a voice that could be measured against the wound she'd given me. When she leaned over the bed to kiss my forehead, one of those redundant public gestures that said, "I am good," she did not expect me to be more than a prop. The last thing she said, low and cruel, was the almost private prayer, "You should have died that day." The sentence landed like a pebble thrown into a large, quiet pool. I felt its ripple. I felt the work I had been doing respond. The muscles under my hip, the ones that had been asleep with shock, answered with a little tremor. It was not cinematic. It was not sudden. It was a small, honest rebellion. I placed my palms on the armrests of the wheelchair and pulled with all the slow intensity of someone who has taught himself to hold on. I drew inch by inch the motion that no one in that neat performance had accounted for. The vinyl complained. The chair wheels squealed. For a second there was no one in the world but the linoleum and my breath. Then the front door clicked. He froze, still half in the ritual of congratulation. Jenna looked at me as if someone had lit a match under a sealed letter. The administrator went from polite neutrality to professional alert. A neighbor who had come in with a casserole gasped, and I felt the simple, enormous thing happen. I stood up. It was not pretty. It was not triumphant, in the way a movie imagines climaxes. My knees argued with gravity. My left leg felt like a rope of wet cloth. But standing is not about beauty. It is about presence. I made a sound, wooden, breathy, but it was my sound. I put my weight on both feet and steadied on the bed rail until my shoulders learned to carry their duty again. Jenna froze in the doorway with a pen in her hand. The man she had been introducing as help took a step back and checked his watch like a man whose props had gone live. Diplomacy sagged into surprised calculation. The administrator cleared her throat in the way professionals do before they shift from curiosity to procedure. I did not yell. I did not scream for cameras. I let the room collect the truth the way a ledger collects numbers, slowly, then inevitably. "You're not signing anything," I said. My voice came from a place that had practiced quiet. It had the small steel of a man who had decided patience was not surrender. Rosa and Tom, two ordinary witnesses, were suddenly part of the scene. Ordinary people who remembered the small details that matters. The administrator reached for her phone. Procedure would begin. There would be calls, notes, an investigation. Paperwork, which had been her instrument, was about to be her undoing. She laughed at first, something tight and hollow. "You can't mean this," she said. "This is a scene." She tried to record me, the old trick of turning the stage against a performer. She pointed her phone and called me desperate. But desperation sounds different when you're reading receipts. Desperation loses its rhetorical power when someone hands a list of dates and names to an official, and the official nods and writes them down. Rosa handed her phone to the administrator. Tom confirmed the nights he had noticed. A voicemail I had saved, her voice calling me a burden, played with a small, terrible clarity. The administrator's face changed. She had been trained to be impartial. Impartiality understands evidence. The tension in the room switched hands. What Jenna had tried to make into a quiet finishing, signatures, ink, a minor closing, had suddenly become public record. The wheels she had greased with charm and commerce found grit. Her plan, which depended on absence and the neatness of law, when administered without scrutiny, began to wobble. She accused me of making a scene. "You're humiliating me," she said. There was a tremor of something like fear under the anger. I saw it then. The face of someone who had invested in an illusion and found the illusion being unspooled, carefully, in daylight. I made a choice in that moment. I could have screamed. I could have demanded retribution with a voice loud enough to trend. But revenge that depends on spectacle is fleeting. I wanted something more durable. A slow public accounting that removed the comforts she had bought herself and replaced them with responsibility. So I asked the administrator to file a formal complaint. I asked Rosa to give a full statement. I asked the social worker to keep the logs and ensure they were time-stamped and backed up. I asked Tom if he would confirm what he knew. The room filled with procedure, records and steps that would not be fixed by a polished apology or a clever edit. When the administrator closed her binder and said, "We'll hold any transfers pending investigation," I watched color drain from Jenna's face in a way that felt like sunlight leaving a field. She had been counting on ink. She had not counted on people who kept receipts. I did not feel triumphant. I felt fair. I felt like a man who had finally changed the rules of the game, from secret cruelty to accountable truth. We left the house later that afternoon with the door not closed, in anger, but in the quiet business of consequences. I felt the ache of muscles and the steady relief of things beginning to be set right. Rosa squeezed my hand as we went. Tom saluted me with a small grin. The world had shifted. The rest would be procedure, patience, and the deliberate unraveling of a life built on another man's absence. There was work still to do. Paperwork moves slowly. Rumors circulate faster. But for the first time since the accident, I felt like the author of my own next chapter, rather than a character in a scene someone else had written. We left the house with the day still thin and the smell of coffee hanging like a witness. The administrator closed her binder with the kind of finality that felt like metal on metal. Procedure, they said, would take care of the rest. Procedure is slow, steady, and not sentimental. It does not make for headlines, but it remakes lives in a way headlines never do. The investigation unfolded the way careful work does, a series of small, official movements that add up. Staff statements were collected, logs were examined, the ombudsman asked questions that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with dates and timestamps. When you build a case out of facts, you strip away the costume of performance. Jenna had relied on performance. Paperwork did not. Applaud. The bank called first. An account freeze. Not an accusation with fireworks. Just a practical barrier that said, not yet. The car company put a hold on the lease transfer. A contractor who'd always photographed her fundraisers sent a polite note declining to be featured in an upcoming gala. These were not spectacular losses. They were the draining of favors that had once flowed to her like water. People who make a living on the courtesy of others find out quickly how fragile that currency is. There was a whisper campaign in the worst, slowest way. People who had once offered applause now asked for proof. The mentor who had once introduced her to donors asked for receipts. The church secretary, who used to arrange her speaking slots with a handshake, started requesting references. Little doors that always opened slid shut. It's astonishing how much a life depends on small, invisible permissions, the kind you lose when your name is attached to formal complaints. She tried to manage the optics, Instagram posts with soft filters, carefully cropped photos of her with me, captions about gratitude. But my supporters were not the gullible sort. When you sit in rooms and hear the quiet list of missed nights and unanswered calls, you stop accepting a curated story. People started to show up at the facility, not to point fingers, but to ask plain questions. The more records the administrator produced, the less comfortable her smiling photos became. Then the lover stopped answering. Men like that have a way of disappearing when inconvenience arrives. He retreated into silence, and his absence said more than any argument could have. Jenna's social calendar began to thin. Invitations that had once landed in glossy envelopes arrived with a cautious tone. Pending review, her mentees began to distance themselves with the bureaucratic language of career management. These were small rejections, and small rejections are the sort that compound. She tried to bargain through the phone first. Texts, late-night calls, asking for time, for explanation, for help with payments. I let them sit unread for a long time. There's a strange power to silence when you've been given silence for so long that it became your erasure. Eventually, she came to the house with her mother at her side, two people looking like a pair of actors too tired to keep the stage up. She asked for a loan, for a down payment, for breathing room. She used the words mistake and pressure. She used them as if saying them might erase what had been done. I told her what I would do and what I would not. I would help under conditions, public acknowledgement of neglect, documented restitution for transfers that couldn't be ethically justified, verified volunteer hours at the facility, and a contract that tied any further financial assistance to strict accounting. This was not cruelty, it was proportionality. If a life is built on neglect, repair cannot be handed out as a charity. Repair is work. She signed on a yellow pad, her hands shaky, her face thinner than it had been when she'd strutted around fundraisers. She did not like being accountable in a way that could be checked. Word moved through the town in a new register, not gossip, but questions. "Did you hear she's under review?" people would ask, not viciously, but with an unmistakable distance. The parish called a meeting where she was asked to speak, an awkward kindness that also served as a public ledger. She read a list I had helped draft in council, specific dates, missed visits, documented lapses. The congregation listened as if reading minutes at a board meeting. For the first time, her words did not control the room. She began the volunteer hours as agreed. The work was not glamorous. Folding napkins, straightening blankets, learning to sit and listen to stories that had nothing to do with her timeline. People watched. The facility logged her in. The files accumulated. Her public schedule was a slow, visible record. The humiliation she felt was not humiliation by spectacle. It was humiliation by responsibility. That slow exposure is a far more telling measure of character than a trending clip. There were practical consequences, too. Donors requested audits. A local sponsor pulled its support for her next event. The organizer of a women's leadership dinner withdrew her invitation pending verification. Each small withdrawal was a cooling of the social air she'd once warmed with charisma. She could no longer simply call on favors. She had to produce receipts and testimony. At a neighborhood fundraiser she once chaired, she stood at the back, a woman without a microphone. Someone else took the stage and thanked the community for their generosity without naming her. When a friend issued a cautious greeting, the warmth was measured. She had to watch the privileges she took for granted being redistributed to people who had shown consistency rather than flash. That slow redistribution of respect is what I had been aiming for, not spectacle but durable consequence. Months passed. The forensic accountant's notes were filed. Transfers were unwound where they could be proven improper. Restitution checks were negotiated where appropriate. There were appeals and counters, paperwork that moved like a river through a bureaucracy. Legal terms, injunctions, holds, affidavits were boring, to say but devastating, in effect. They closed off the easy exits she'd once used to flip a scandal into a press release. She did something I had not expected. She asked for public help. Not in private to me anymore. She stood at a small charity luncheon and, with a voice that trembled, laid her errors bare. She told an audience about mismanagement, about pressure, about how she had made mistakes. She did not talk about malice. She talked about misjudgment, and then requested assistance. There is a certain sting to watching someone who once smiled, with comfortable confidence, now hold out a hand in front of people who once admired them. The room did not respond with malice. It responded with sober measures. People give when they feel prudence, not when they feel pity. And then she came to my door one last time. She was smaller than before, not because the months had been hard on her face, though they had, but because she had lost the soft armor of unaccountability. She asked for a bridge loan to keep an apartment. She asked for help to refund donors. She offered apologies that were raw and not performative. She did not ask for forgiveness in the way a script teaches you to. She asked for something more humbling, permission to be part of the life she had exploited. I could have refused outright. There is a pleasure, briefly delicious and then empty, in denying someone who hurt you. But the man who had done the calculation and walked through months of tedium to make something right was not interested in empty victories. He was interested in restoration that included consequence. So I extended a limited hand, a bridge loan with a contract, public accounting steps, volunteer verification, restitution schedules. I made sure the terms were clear and publicly enforceable. The moment she took the check, she did not look victorious. She looked accountable. That was the point. There was one final scene that sealed the lesson I had meant to teach, not by spectacle, but by enduring accountability. At a small public event where donors and neighbors gathered, she stood and asked for help. She explained how she had misused trust and asked for time to repair it. Her asking was not theatrical. It was practical and devastating to watch. She had to face people who had once called her friend and ask that they accept conditional assistance on the basis of visible work. The humiliation was not a scream. It was the daily practice of proving you deserve a second chance. When the legal work was done, when accounts had been corrected, and the volunteer hours logged, something settled. My life, which had once been curated by others into a neat absence, was inhabited again. I repaired the porch I loved, my hands still clumsy in places but steady enough to hold a new corner square. I spent long afternoons in the garden that Norma, a neighbor, had helped me tend. I took walks that started small and got larger, the way muscle and will conspire to reclaim a route. The woman who had taken my life as a commodity, Jenna, kept her dignity in small measures and earned it back in smaller ones. She did not vanish into disgrace. She learned to show up and to be checked. The lover moved out of the picture, a marginal presence erased by reality. People forgave in a way that was conditional. They reopened doors, but with lists attached. It was not mercy in the cinematic sense. It was a negotiated civic restoration. And then, because the story asks for quiet reflection rather than loud triumph, I sat on the back steps at dusk and let the last light measure what had been done. The house wakes differently when you've rebuilt the trust of a town. It creaks and settles, but it does not feel like a stage for lies anymore. I watched a neighbor pass by, tip my hat, and felt the ordinary exchange of recognition return. In the final 25 seconds, I speak plainly, not for an audience, but for anyone who has been used and decided to stand. Patience is not a passive thing. It can be a shape you form to gather facts, witnesses, and time, until the moment you are ready to reclaim what was stolen. Justice, real justice, is more often paperwork than melodrama. It asks for steadiness, for records, for people who will say what they saw. If you've been erased, you don't always need to shout back. Sometimes you need to keep track. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. Thank you for watching.